it's easy to, when talking about systems, it's easy to sort of think this is a technical issue, and it's really not. Like, fundamentally, this question of electoral reform is about values, it's about fairness and equality. And, you know, as Labour members, that should be the start and the end of the conversation for us. We, I think, ought to believe in a system of any kind that gives people an equal voice and equal votes, and that's what it's all about. I do want to expand a little bit on one area, though, because as well as it being about the values of equality, it also has a big impact on the kind of politics you get. The kind of voting system you have really is a determining factor on the kind of politics you get in the country and the kind of outcomes you get as a society as well. It's really interesting that this is an area that's been studied in a lot of depth for decades. Some of it really recent, some of it going back many years, about the sort of socioeconomic outcomes you get from different voting systems. But it's really been completely absent from the political debate about electoral reform in the UK. When we've had this sort of public discussion and political discussion, it's always been about systems, not about you know, the outcomes. But as I say, there's this whole wealth of evidence, and one of the things we've done jointly, Make Votes Matter and Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform have put out a couple of reports which, as well as looking at the democratic arguments for electoral reform, look at the outcomes-based arguments. We had one from 2017, which is quite a flashy, accessible report, which is well worth a look. We've had a more recent one last year, which is, I think, quite a bit more dense. There's a lot more detail in there. So if you're keen, then have a look at that one too. And if you sign up on the sign-up form, we'll email both of them to you after the meeting. And in these reports, we brought together a lot of the political science and the academic evidence. The first thing to say is that, as Maria alluded to at one point, first past the post has a right-wing bias, and it's not just first past the post, it's majoritarian systems in general, winner-takes-all systems. So that includes AV, it includes the sort of two-round system they use in France, anything based on single-member districts where you just have one winner in each system, majoritarian systems. So there was a study from just a few years ago by an LSE professor and a Harvard professor working jointly together. And they looked at a whole load of developed democracies over about 50 years. And they found that basically when you split them up into proportional democracies and majoritarian winner-takes-all democracies, and you look at the kind of governments they've had, when you ignore the centrist governments, you just sort of leave those alone, then proportional democracies had left-leaning governments 3/4 of the time, majoritarian democracies had right-leaning governments 3/4 of the time. And I mean, it sounds pretty striking, and there's a bit of ambiguity in there in terms of like defining left and right wing and so on, but really quite strong sort of headline outcomes of that. And for an even more sort of nuanced look at it, there's a study that came out just last year by a American professor called Jonathan Rodden, and he's done a whole book on this subject. Basically, he looked at again basically all of the developed democracies in the world and the electoral systems they have and the kind of outcomes they get, but instead of just counting so proportional democracies got left-wing governments this many times and right-wing governments that many times, he actually looked at how people in those countries voted and then compared the leanings of the parliament they elected to how they voted. And what he found was even more surprising is that every single country with a majoritarian voting system, on average, has had parliaments and governments that are more right-wing than the voters who elect them since World War II on average. So if you look at any winner-takes-all democracy, people vote in elections, and in any given election, you should expect Parliament to be slightly, or in some cases significantly, to the right of the voters overall. not a single winner-takes-all country, except when you have proportional democracies, you don't get an opposite bias, you don't get a left-wing bias, but you get exactly as you'd expect, you get exactly the sort of parliament that matches how people voted. So if the centre of gravity in politics in a country is centre-left under a proportional system, it will also be in parliament, whereas under a majoritarian system, it will probably be centre or centre-right. And there's a question about why this is the case, and there's a couple of explanations. One, they're sort of complementary. One of the ones, the one put forward by Jonathan Rodden, is something else that Maria alluded to, and this is because left-wing voters are the most densely concentrated group of voters there are. Tend to be really clustered together in cities and in major towns. It's partly because you get lots of sort of lefty liberal kids moving to cities, but that's a small point. The main thing is it's sort of the geography of the Industrial Revolution. Going right back to the Industrial Revolution, people came together in these settlements where industry happened, and that's where the progressive parties across the world started up, in these sort of dense urban areas. And the historical relic of that is we still have a really big concentration of left-wing voters in those areas. And under a proportional system, it doesn't matter how your voters are spread out, but under a winner-takes-all single-member constituency system, it really does, because we in the Labour Party pile up huge majorities in inner city seats. Win with like 80% of the vote, which means very few of those votes were actually needed to win that seat, and very few of them made a difference to what Parliament looks like. In fact, at the moment, despite having a pretty bad general election, we hold 3/4 of the safest seats in the UK at the moment, the safest sort of 35 seats. In the 2017 general election, we held 34 of the 35 safest seats. And across those 34 seats, there were enough excess votes that we didn't need to win those seats to win 50 ordinary seats if they were spread out, in an optimal way. So that's part of the reason, and it's because it's based on this sort of phenomenon of clustering voters in settlements. It's something that's happened basically in every industrialized democracy, and it's sort of a global phenomenon in winner-takes-all systems. The other aspect to it is, under proportional systems, it's much easier to form governing coalitions of the left, both in terms of actually cooperating with other parties and forming coalitions, but also it's, when they spelled this out in the paper, they used a model which asks you to imagine having basically three equally sized groups in society: low income, middle income, and high income. And under PR, you assume they all vote for a party that matches them. So a third of the vote goes to a low income party, third goes to middle income, third goes to higher income. And they showed that basically the low and the middle income will usually have an incentive to cooperate after an election, form a government, so they can redistribute away from the high income group, basically. But when you have a two-party system, which you get under first past the post, in order to do that, the low and the middle income groups basically have to form a pre-election coalition, and that just creates all these artificial barriers to actually being able to do that. And they're the barriers we're all very familiar with from the Labour Party, since its foundation, this constant battle between centrist and left, and it's much harder. So that's kind of the bias, but what you find is you actually get much better socioeconomic outcomes as well, in terms of a whole range of indicators that we in the Labour Party care about under proportional systems. So, for example, you get generally much better income equality under proportional systems. Academics have studied it and found that this is a statistically significant, and as they've said, it's a causal impact. So having a proportional system means you're more likely to develop better income equality. And when you look at the OECD countries, for example, just about the top 50% of the OECD in terms of income equality all use proportional systems. Like, we're way down the bottom, or close to it. And that applies across a whole range of other areas as well. I won't go through them all in detail, but on things like social spending, on whether a country has a welfare state and how high that welfare spending is, even on things like climate change and action against climate change, environmental protection, and things like trade union rights, workers' rights. Countries with proportional systems, on average, will do significantly better than countries with majoritarian systems. It's partly because you get more right-wing governments under majoritarian systems, but it's also partly because it just changes your whole political culture to have a proportional system. You become forced to sort of compromise and collaborate, and it leads to just much better policies which are more in the interest of most people. And I just want to point out that I'm not making the argument here that if we in the UK suddenly tomorrow had a proportional system, we'd automatically get all of these things, we'd have like an equal society, and climate change would be fixed and all of that. That's not the point. The point is that the evidence is that when you fight for those outcomes under a proportional system, you're much more likely to achieve your goals, and that conversely having a winner-takes-all system is a real barrier to achieving. I'm just going to finish up by saying a little bit about where Labour is on electoral reform at the moment and the campaign. It will just be very brief because we do want to hear from all of you. So we in Make Votes Matter and Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform, we've been sending speakers to CLPs and branches for a few years now, really ramping it up over the last couple of years. And we've been to over 200 in total. And one of the things we found is that just about everywhere we went, we found most people in the Labour Party are in favour of a proportional system. We always do a show of hands, and almost always we found most people were in favour, often unanimously. And we were able to confirm that last December when we did some polling via YouGov, which just polled Labour members, and found that 76% of Labour Party members think the party should back PR, just 12% opposed. So really significant support. And in fact, it's worth mentioning that you probably know Labour's been running its consultation in the last couple of months, and the National Policy Forum has, and the Justice and Home Affairs Commission, which covers constitutional issues as well as justice, anything to do with cabinet office, really wide brief. We counted, or I should say Maria mainly counted, the responses which are on the public website, and 60% of all of the responses to that commission were in favour of electoral reform. So there's huge support among the membership, and really the main thing we've got to do in the campaign is to just mobilise that support and make sure it's feeding through the party policy. I'll just say very briefly, there's a couple of unions that are in favour, actually 3 now, there's a couple who are opposed. The biggest ones, Unite and Unison, and haven't actually got any policy on PR at the moment. We did have motions going to lots of union conferences this summer, but obviously conferences cancelled, so we'll be doing that again next year and hopefully bringing some of the really big unions on board. But in the meantime, TSSA, Bakers Union and the Musicians Union are all in favour, so that's some progress. And just final thing is, among MPs, about a third of Labour MPs are in favour of PR. A smaller number are openly in favour of first past the post, which means that the biggest number are people who've either not said where they stand on it or say that they haven't made up their mind. Keir Starmer has said some very supportive things. In fact, he said the words, "We need electoral reform," which I think on paper at least makes him the most positive leader on this issue that we've possibly ever had, but certainly in quite a long time. So we really think now's the time, and by the next conference, which is now September 2021, if there hasn't yet been a policy commitment, we're going to be sort of really trying to coordinate as strong a push to conference as possible to get as many motions as we can and get a firm policy commitment. So I'll probably leave it there, but let's open it up to discussion.